Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Fresno. Joining us for the second half of our show is Glenn Carroll, Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Stanford University and Lane Professor of Organizations. Glenn, welcome to the show.
Hi, Bill. Thank you.
Glenn, I asked you on the show because you're an authentic expert on authenticity. I mean, the Stanford brand and your title attest to that. But perhaps the best known of your academic pieces that you've published is your study on beer, in particular trying to make sense out of the microbrewery movement. I'm going to confess that I'm a bit of a skeptic. I mean, to me, if it ain't Guinness, it ain't beer. But take us down the beer trail and along the way, teach us about the power of authenticity.
Sure. So happy to be here and happy to talk about this, Bill. I first started studying beer in the early 1980s, and it was an outgrowth of a study I'd done in the newspaper publishing industry, where in newspapers you saw two industrial trends going on at the same time. One was an increasing concentration of ownership and economic power in big daily newspapers, and that was a story everybody talked about and was worried about. But at the same time, you saw an increase and a rise of the specialist press that was just flourishing in response to that. And I developed a model about how these two trends were possibly interrelated, which was something that at least a lot of theories at the time did not expect. After I published that study, I was asked, well, it's a nice analysis of newspaper publishing, but where else might this be going on? And this was in the early, mid-1980s. And I looked around, I looked at the conditions in the newspaper industry and, what I thought was producing it in my model, and also compared to other industries where something like this might happen. And the one I saw that looked just right for it was beer brewing in the United States. And this was early 1980s, where there was just an inkling of the microbrewery movement.
There were a big brand age.
1, 2, 3, 4 microbreweries and brew pubs out there. And being a brash young man at the time, I actually made a prediction in print, which is something I probably wouldn't have the guts to do today. But I made a prediction in print that the beer brewing industry looked prime for a surge of specialist producers of the kind that we'd seen in newspaper publishing. And after having put this claim out there, I then got worried about it and started studying beer more seriously, including watching it go on. And it was, it literally happened under my eyes, because at the time, a lot of the microbrewers were in Northern California, and I could go interview them and talk to them while this whole process was going on. And so, it led to a study where we talked to lots of brewers, we talked to lots of people in the industry, but we also collected very systematic data on all the brewers that were operating either as microbrewers or as brew pub operators or contract brewers throughout the period from post-Prohibition up until the early 2000s. And we were able then to document the whole trend of the rise of microbrewers, which really became hundreds and then thousands of microbrewers, and how they were developing even as the mass market for beer, that is the Anheuser-Busch, Coors, Molson's, all of those were still concentrating, becoming bigger at the same time.
So if you look at the different aspects of beer, you look at quality control, you look at consistency, and then you look at things like flavor, where does authenticity fit?
Yeah. So the original story I had about how these two trends could go on at the same time had to do with location in different spaces of industry consumer demand, and how there was a tension between the two. And I thought the same thing was going on in beer that was going on in newspaper publishing. In fact, as I studied it more deeply, I came to a different conclusion. I came to the conclusion that what was going on was, when people were attracted to a microbrewed beer, it was because of what they thought they were drinking. They were drinking something that they thought was brewed by traditional 19th century methods, using organic or real or traditional inputs and ingredients. And there was something about it that was heavily romanticized compared to the beer that they got from Anheuser-Busch or Coors. And the attraction was simply that. And at the same time that they were attracted to it, they were also assuming often that it was higher quality. And sometimes it was, but often it wasn't. I mean, the major brewers are actually just production powerhouses in the sense that they produce a biological product, millions and millions of barrels a year at a fairly cheap price, without ever any contamination or flaws or any real problems in quality. So that, the technical expertise is really with the macro guys, but the micro guys had this appeal in the market, and people were quite proud of it and being able to drink them and differentiate them and talk to their friends about them. And so for me, at least our story, my interpretation of it was their reading of those products, what those products meant to them, the identity of those products and the producers behind them, and ultimately the authenticity of those products as they related to the origins of the industry were what was appealing rather than anything about the objective characteristics of the beer or the product itself.
Well, your research on Chinese restaurants in Los Angeles showed that consumers ranked authenticity above hygiene, which means many were willing to risk food poisoning as long as they got what they perceived to be the real thing. What's the real thing?
Well, so in that case, we said there was a period in California in the 1990s where one of the state food commissioners tried to get the Chinese restaurants to remove the barbecued hanging ducks from the windows of the restaurant. And the reason why is because scientific studies apparently show that if a duck meat goes below, it's at a certain temperature range, if you don't have it cooled or you don't have it heated, that bacteria will develop that can be quite dangerous. Similar thing happened later with Korean noodles and a bunch of ethnic foods like this. And that commissioner was going to ban the ability to put the duck in the window of a Chinese restaurant. And there was a kind of public outrage about that, and the commissioner was ridiculed in the papers, and ultimately the state legislature passed a law, I believe, or an interpretation that said, we're going to let them keep hanging these ducks here this way. Anyway, now, the science is still there, but it's a case of where traditions of decades or centuries of ethnic peoples, of how they eat and how they prepare their foods, runs up against new scientific knowledge. And I don't doubt the science, but I think probably the incidence of problems is very, very rare. The people on the other side often doubt the science completely and say, look, if that's the case, how could we have been eating it for hundreds of years? Now, I think what's happened is, generally more and more consumers say that, if they're searching for authenticity, they understand that kind of a lot of modern rules and regulations get in the way. And that, if you really want authenticity from something that goes back decades or centuries, or ethnic authenticity of a group or people that's not really exposed to modern society a lot, that what you've got to do is not worry about these modern rules. You've got to suspend judgment on the modern rules and go for what it is you're looking for, the authenticity. Kind of the raw milk movement is kind of the raw cheese movement, I think, are playing up to these things as well. Technically, they're illegal, but people want them, and the people who want them will do just about anything to get them, and they'll swear by the value of them, both for their psychological well-being, but also for their health.
Whole Foods has to be one of the most successful practitioners of authenticity marketing since the modern trend began. On the rare occasions that I'm willing to set foot in there, there's a palpable difference between the shoppers I see at Whole Foods and the folks I run into at Costco, where I feel more at home. How would you describe the differences between Whole Foods shoppers and Costco shoppers?
That's a good question. So I don't have systematic data on that. My first reaction, Bill, is that they're probably not that different. I think that they're, at least among the consumers I see, there's a pretty healthy overlap. Obviously the Costco consumers are more likely to have families because that's why that's why they're able to buy in the bulk quantities. But at least the Costcos I go to here in Northern California, the quality of their products keeps increasing. There's a lot of brand overlap with stuff you would get in Whole Foods or places like that. And, the movement to things like organic products is the same. So my guess would be the socioeconomic backgrounds, the status of the people in those two types of markets are probably not as different as you might think at first. Now, I think I see where you're going, however. The Costco person is probably a little more mainstream, probably a little less interested in organic, probably has more of a normal diet and is, probably more willing to do things that, we would consider mainstream, whereas the Whole Food shoppers are probably trending a little bit in a different direction. However, remember, Whole Foods sells lots of meat and lots of traditional products, and they're doing quite well selling them.
Do consumers who discover a new category of authentic item garner social prestige among their friends if the trend catches on?
I think there's some. One big unanswered question is, why it is that modern consumers increasingly seek authenticity in products and services. And, there's a lot of speculative answers about that having to do with, in a mass society, people want to express their individualism, find some way to individuate themselves, and things like that. I don't know we can ever answer those questions. They're fun to think about, but I don't know if science can ever answer them. As a sociologist, one thing that's occurred to me when, especially when I saw this in the early microbrewery movements, was one of the things that happens is when these products come out, like, early microbrewed beers, and they're using these traditional recipes, traditional ingredients that are, fairly obscure in terms of what's known about them and so that the people who really get into this movement learn all the details of the production process, of the ingredients, of the taste of beer, and of the producers which they're consuming their products of. And then they will, in semi-public settings, they will talk about them. They'll let other people know. And so I think they create a forum for status generation, I'd say, where you can look really smart in a group of your smart friends talking with authority about something very esoteric that they don't know about, and you talk about it as though it's a really important thing because you're going to consume it in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So it gets people status in the short run, and I think that there's some of that goes on in a lot of this.
Glenn, contemporary art departs so spectacularly from classic norms that there doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason as to what gets judged authentic and what gets dismissed as garbage. What role do experts play in making that call, and what distinguishes contemporary art critics from carnival barkers and snake oil salesmen?
Well, I'm far from an expert on the art word, Bill, but let me give you a few thoughts about it. So one thing I think is going on there is I think the critics are still important. I think the critics are connected to the art communities. And I think what we're seeing is that, with things like conceptual art or even visual art that doesn't look immediately high quality to an outsider, let's say, what it becomes important is the story behind the art. What is if there's a message, what's the message? But even more importantly, what's the biography of the artist? What life did he or she lead? What kind of experiences did he or she have? And how might those be expressed in the art piece itself? And what does that then mean to other people when they see that? And so I don't think you can evaluate a lot of these things outside the context of that biography and the community that it comes from. And the community has to have recognized and agreed with that interpretation before it becomes a big deal.
Well, speaking about the importance of narrative that goes with biography, let's talk about the role of authenticity in politics. Take us back to one of the icons of political authenticity, Barry Goldwater. He lost his bid for the presidency by a landslide, yet went on to found the modern conservative movement, which reached its pinnacle 20 years later with Ronald Reagan. One of the charges that one group of Republicans will level at another is RINO, which stands for Republican in name only. Who's the keeper of authenticity on the right? Today.
I don't know generally. What struck me is I think that part of the strong appeal to Donald Trump, which was completely unexpected by, of course, many people and a lot of the experts, his appeal has a lot to do with the perception that he is authentic. And, you can find polls. I remember reading a poll last December in the New York Times, I think, that says something like 75% of Republicans believe that Trump, quote, says what he believes rather than what he wants people to hear. And so that's a kind of moral authenticity in that, he's not following a pre-made script. He's not following a role. It's reinforced by when he says things like, I'm not a politician. I've never been a politician. I don't want to be a politician. And when he says things like, I'm not politically correct. All of those things are reinforcing a message like, here's a person he's not strategic in the usual sense of a politician, and he's doing this for the right reasons, I think, is what people who believe he's authentic would say. Now, of course, there's another side. Some people say, well, all that's just a different strategy. But I think that side, that's not the side that's supporting him, right? I think the group that support him, a lot of them believe in his message is authentic. And I think there are even people who are quite critical of Trump who might say he's authentic, even though they don't agree with his message or what he's doing. Being authentic means you have this unique voice that's yours and not given to you from someone else.
But let's look at biography. Donald Trump is an elite member of the 1%, and yet he's branded himself as the authentic spokesman for the downtrodden blue-collar worker. FDR pulled off that same trick.
Yeah.
How did they both manage that pivot?
Well, so I think it's fascinating that they did. The same fact amazes me, every time I hear him talk or think about the election. The reality is that he did pull it off, and that's what's propelling his campaign. I think we will analyze forever and say, how was he able to do that? But it's just not. The one story I think I read by by Michael Kinsley in the Washington Post about Trump in the spring, said something like, he is an authentic self-made man in the sense that his character's self-made. Obviously, he's not self-made economically or financially, but he's a self-made character in that we never have seen a person with this personality who's out there and doing the kind of things he's done the way he has. And in that sense, he's a unique person that has this appeal. But it is interesting because if you go to people and you say, look, how can you think he's going to support the working class? He's not on their side in all his economic needs. You go out there and you say, how do you think he's going to support evangelicals when he's had 3 wives and all kinds of stuff like that? And, and they're willing to overlook that because they believe what they hear and somehow it resonates with them in a way that has defied the whole political establishment.
So, Glenn, let's swing around to the Democratic side. Against the complex character of Barry Goldwater, we have John F. Kennedy, whose assassination transformed him from a controversial young president into a frozen demigod. Democratic politicians have strived to measure up to Jack Kennedy ever since. Yet Bill Clinton, the most successful of all of them, is perhaps best known for his Kennedy-like sexual peccadillos. So who's the keeper of authenticity on the left?
Wow, that's a great question. And again, I'm not a political scientist, so...
But you're a brand man.
You're really asking me to stretch here. I think in the recent election, I think you'd have to say it was, again, to great surprise of everyone, including myself, you'd have to say it was Bernie Sanders. There's something going on in the country that, the kind of populist-like messages of both Sanders and Trump, defying the political establishment have just resonated with a part of America, I guess what Nixon used to call the silent majority, but a part of America that feels like they've been left behind. And, on the East and West Coast, we don't see them that much or think about them. And it's just, it's an awakening, I think, for all the political establishment and for the country about what happened in this election.
Could it be that the electorate is just dying for authenticity and they'll chase it wherever they see it?
Well, I think there is a great deal of fatigue with overt and obvious strategic behavior on the part of our leaders and, the unwillingness to kind of get together and make deals and compromise and do things that they should do, and to kind of use the system. This, again, is not necessarily my view, but perceptions use the system to further their own ends or their own causes rather than to try and do something good for the whole of the country.
Speaking of overt and obvious strategic behavior, among the many things Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton has been called, authentic isn't one of them. How did she miss that bus?
Yeah, that's also a good question, because you would think that she could craft a story there. I guess it's, again, I'm speculating, but, she has a background as an attorney. She's been in difficult situations where she's kind of had to be careful what she had to say, starting back with all of Bill's escapades, and has kind of tried to always talk her way through that. And, when you start talking and worrying about legal landmines, you often come across looking very strategic. And I think that she's done enough of that, and people remember it, that's something that dogs her, and she just can't escape. Even though I have no doubt, I think it's true for most successful politicians. When you're in a room with them, with a small group of people, one-on-one, you see the charm, you see the charisma, that you see how they really are able to touch people almost always. I don't doubt that's true for her as well.
Swinging back to your comfort zone, when I look at your list of markets where authenticity plays a major differentiating role, notably absent are things like electronics, kitchen appliances, airlines, automobiles, and even healthcare. Is that because their safety and quality can be objectively measured compared to, say, art, music, or politics?
I think that's right. I think it's still the case that, if it's something where it's very expensive and it needs to function right, and the costs of it being dysfunctional are extremely high, and we can still measure the quality in a meaningful way. But I think in those cases, and you're right, I would never want to go on authentic airlines, where they were trying to figure out how to fly.
Right.
I've been on a few in East Europe at times where I sometimes thought that was the first time they were flying, but that's a scary experience, right? So, I think you may see more and more of this with things like cars as we, evolve the meaning of transportation and how cars are going to work. And, cars in many ways are expressions of individual personalities. So I would think something like a Tesla might actually be playing up to this same type of consumer.
So, Glenn, what advice would you give to young up-and-coming entrepreneurs and even politicians who want to capitalize on the power of authenticity?
I think they first have to decide whether or not this is their strategic advantage. And if they do, then they have to recognize that, the same thing that is the source of your strategic advantage also constrains you. That's true for any strategic advantage in economic or social life. So what that means is, if you decide my thing is to be authentic, then, it's probably going to limit your flexibility going forward, because you can't wind up doing lots of things to lots of people, because you get caught at it and you'll be accused of not being authentic. The same is true of a business. If your product is something that you're claiming is authentic because it's sourced a certain way or made a certain way, or you have certain types of people involved in making it, what you need to do is have maybe, let's say, radical transparency into your organization about what those things are, who the people are, and invite in the public to come and see them and to show that this is really what's going on, and make it as transparent as you can, and make it clear that you spent a lot of money and time doing this. This was not just a window dressing thing that you intended to do just to get a few extra sales.
It's the real thing.
Yep, the real thing.
Glenn, it's been a delight chatting with you. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Bill. A lot of fun.
That was Glenn Carroll, Lane Professor of Organizations at Stanford University, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And while you're at it, take a look at realclearfuture.com for daily updates on the next big wave of technologies. We'd like to thank our sponsor, Old Boston Restorations, for their support. Old Boston is a boutique property management company in Boston's South End. Visit them online at oldbostonrestorations.com. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.